Okay, we're live.
All right, good morning and welcome to the House Environment Committee. This morning we are welcoming James Murdoch from Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
In here. You can go ahead and
Ready to share?
ready to share. Okay.
Sharing, can you all see the screen behind me?
Yes.
Okay. It's like being in the class and being on the screen. All right. Thank you, everybody. Great to see you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and thank you for the invitation. Representative Shelton. As you mentioned, my name is Jed Murdoch. I'm a faculty member at the University of Vermont. We have a wildlife and fisheries biology program in the Rubenstein School. Been there since about 2009. I actually was born on the campus at UVM, so I didn't fall too far from the tree. But I've been there about 15, 16 years. I'm also serving as one of the associate deans of the Rubenstein School at the moment too. I do some other work here in the state. I currently am chairing the Board of Trustees at the Nature Conservancy, and I also chair a scientific advisory group for mammals here in the state. So that's a group that advises the Endangered Species Committee, which then advises the Secretary. So our role is to provide information on mammals to the ESC, assessments of mammals. I spent a lot of time in my life studying mammals, especially carnivores like this. I've had the pleasure of working on a number of smaller carnivores, from foxes to badgers to small cats, even to some of the bigger ones like lions and more recently snow leopards. Here in Vermont, I've been involved in a number of sponsored projects that have involved what you see here, bobcats. We just finished a couple years ago a big study of moose up in the Northeast Kingdom. I was also involved for some time in a project related to marten and marten recovery here. Of course, is a very high-profile species because of its endangered status here in the state. I do have a number of working relationships with Vermont Fish and Wildlife, but I've also partnered with other agencies like Vermont Agency of Transportation, who's interested in broader issues around wildlife connectivity and how animal movements intersect with roads and road crossing structures. So with that said, you posed a couple of questions, Representative Sheldon, that I'm hoping I can come here to provide some insights on. I'm not here to necessarily advocate for a specific position. I don't have an agenda, but I think there's some maybe some helpful points that I can cover related to these two questions. What are the benefits of apex predators and ecosystems? So large carnivores for the most part. And what would it take to introduce catamounts here in the state? I understand you're considering a feasibility study around this, which I think is a very exciting prospect. So I want to comment on each one of those and maybe draw on some other examples. And I hope this is of use to you.
We're working on it.
Oh, we are. Okay.
Sarah,
That's okay.
would you like to back up?
No, I just didn't know if I just want, again,
You got it.
technology.
It's probably
No,
easier to
it's no
use your
problem. I
iPad.
just want to have it.
Raising our heads all
It's okay. It sounds like it's a large file, so.
It's fine.
I'm sorry, yeah.
No,
I should have- I
no
should,
problem.
oh dear. Okay, all right.
Good. All good.
All right, so I'm sure you're aware of this, and I imagine you've had testimony around large carnivores and predators in the past. But I would just say a couple of things. We know that across the world, globally, we've got about 245 species of terrestrial carnivores that are wide-ranging and cover just about every major habitat on Earth, large and small. If you look primarily at the large top tier of that group, so about 30, 40 species, approximately 3/4 of those species are significantly declining in Merida threatened status using the IUCN criteria. So not doing very well. And those include a lot of the hot button species that you might have, I'm sure you're aware of, like African lions and snow leopards and so forth.
I'm sorry, did you say 1/3?
About three-quarters
Three-quarters.
of that top tier are declining. Declining for a lot of reasons. We know that they're large-bodied animals. They have large home ranges, large spatial requirements. They occur in low density. They have low birth rates and low fecundity, so they don't recruit well into the back into the population. And they're oftentimes in conflict with people because they eat livestock. They can move into areas where natural lands are constrained. So the big litany of drivers includes habitat loss and degradation, and that's not to be underestimated. A lot of the times climate change as an impact comes up as a really key issue around wildlife. But for this group of mammals in particular, it's changes in habitat loss and alteration that's really significant. Persecution, people out killing them, retaliatory killing, overuse, overhunting in some cases for legal purposes, and depletion of prey. I mean, they need things to eat. And so oftentimes they're existing in landscapes where we removed a lot of the prey base. So there are consequences that come with that. And so in addressing that first question, like what are the values of these large carnivores? Not necessarily values, but the benefits. I kind of look at that through the lens of what are the effects that these animals have in ecosystems. Benefits kind of in the eye of the beholder. You know, there are trade-offs to having these animals in ecosystems. Much of what we know about carnivore ecology is that they exist in landscapes and have a whole suite of different complex relationships. And we know much of those complex relationships through studies where we've reintroduced them into some places. We have removed them from other environments. And in some cases, we've been able to study when they've moved into a novel environment. So I see like effects of these carnivores really in three bins: ecological, economic, and social or cultural. So I'm thinking about effects that they can have ecologically. Excuse me, so much of what we know has come from this example of wolf reintroduction in the Yellowstone ecosystem, which I'm sure most people are familiar with. Wolves were absent for 70 years. Ungulate populations exploded, particularly elk, and then moved down into environments that they typically weren't in, especially riparian environments. So these wolves and other large carnivores do have direct impacts, right? Direct effects on ungulate populations. So that's through basically the act of predation. And so they can reduce and suppress ungulate populations because of that. And that within itself ends up leading to a variety of indirect effects on environment, and many of those can be beneficial. So what happens to prey? Well, their numbers decline, but oftentimes because they have a predator in this ecosystem, they end up changing their behaviors to manage that risk of predation. All of a sudden there's a predator out there, and so they end up shifting oftentimes into different habitats. And that's exactly what happened in the case of wolves. They moved out of places like the Old Faithful Basin, right? That big famous part of Yellowstone, riparian area. Hard pressed to see them there now. They kind of moved out into the hills, into more forested and rugged environments to manage that predation risk. And as a consequence of that, which you can sort of see in this diagram here, that led to changes to these riparian systems. So now all of a sudden you had regeneration of willow and aspen in particular, but other plant species, tree species, without that browsing pressure, right? All of a sudden they moved out, regeneration. And there are a cascade of effects that then followed that, right? So you had changes in stream morphology because those riparian areas now had different vegetation communities. That led to, in the case of wolves, conditions that allowed other species to recover, like beaver. We also saw that there were benefits here to bird communities as well. Now all of a sudden you had far more bird habitat for nesting, which increased bird diversity. So we oftentimes think about this in terms of cascading effects. These animals have significant direct impacts on larger species, but those direct impacts cascade down across different levels in environment, right? Across different trophic levels that can have impacts on vegetation communities, small mammal communities, ecosystem processes, and so forth. A couple quick benefits that I just mentioned with greater tree diversity, biomass, that does increase carbon storage. We see in some cases, other benefits include predation leading to fewer cases of disease spillover from wildlife into livestock. And then biodiversity increases in the case of this system here, bird diversity increased quite a bit. Another study by Mark Elbrock, I think, who may have spoken to this group, looked at carrion, right? So the carcasses left over from predation events and found that there were upwards of, I think, 39 species that were using those carcasses, both bird and mammal species. So they become centers of biodiversity in a lot of ways. Oftentimes, I think it's also helpful to recognize that there can be economic benefits too that come with large carnivore restoration. We know that they attract a lot of public attention, and because of that, can be great flagship species for broader conservation. We see increases in tourism and in hunting in some places. So if you look at the Yellowstone ecosystem with wolves, tourism alone, just for the chance to see wolves, drives somewhere on the order of, make sure I get this right, $22 to $48 million annually by people, again, that are just interested in getting a chance to see wolves in that system. There is importance to large carnivores for hunting too, which oftentimes can be distasteful for society in some places. But I do want to mention that as well. If you look at African lions here, to hunt an African lion, we're looking at anywhere from about I think it's on the order of about 24,000 plus just for a permit to kill a lion. So in sub-Saharan Africa, there's 23 countries that allow for trophy hunting of these animals and others. That brings in about 201 million in revenue and serves about 18 to 19,000 international hunters. Other effects that might be economic that hit maybe closer to home include a study that you might have seen earlier too that looks specifically at cougar effects on ungulates. Reducing ungulates, then reducing density, can have a reduction in roadkills. So one study simulated the impact of cougars here in the Northeast and what impacts that would have on reduced wildlife vehicle collisions, which can cost a lot in terms of injury and life and economically. In fact, they estimated over a 30-year time period with an established cougar population, the expectation based on their modeling was that there'd be about a 22% decrease in wildlife vehicle collisions. So we're talking about over 150 fewer mortalities on roads here in the Northeast, upwards of about a little over $2 billion in loss due to damage that's avoided. So reducing ungulate numbers could have that benefit here in the Northeast that directly translates into economic conditions.
Who study was that?
I can get that for you. I think that was Gilbert and others. Sorry, I don't have it mentioned here. I can get that for you. Yeah,
Thank you.
I think I can't remember the year, but it's relatively recent.
It was the Northeast broadly that you were saying?
It was the Northeast, yeah. I think it may have also put in New York and some other areas, but I can pass that on to you.
It's just, I think it's in that Panthera
Okay, great.
paper. That's one of the papers. I believe it was.
And then I'd also say that there are cultural benefits too. So just that sort of the non-material benefits that come with having these animals in the landscape can be valued by many people. The joy, the satisfaction of having animals out in the environment. That ties in with spirituality and the sense of wilderness as well. When I grew up in Shelburne, in my early years through now, I feel like seeing a black bear has always left a mark on me, and it gives me a lot of satisfaction and joy to see that. I feel like I remember every time I've seen a black bear, and I bet that's the case for many of you here too, if you've had the chance to see one. So that is non-material, but it does have, I think, an important value here. So a couple quick points about what I think it would take to reintroduce catamounts here into Vermont, which I think is partly under consideration here. It's funny, I did a quick AI image generation on this and asked one of the AI engines to develop an image based on a prompt around catamount reintroduction here in Vermont, and I got this as the image generated for that. It wasn't quite right, so I had to refine this a little bit more. And when I included cougar instead of catamount, it gave me a very fine photo here. That's quite nice. A really amazing, but maybe slightly terrifying technology here. So what would it take? I guess speaking more as a scientist, like what are those things that would be important from a scientific point of view to make this happen? For one, I think it would be helpful to know, like, what would the landscape look like for cougars or catamounts? So where would we expect them to live? Like, Vermont is not created equal. We have different habitats, ecosystems, and so forth. So where would we expect them to live? Now, that's a tricky question because we don't have them living here currently, and records of where they occurred previously, are from the 1800s and probably lack the detail that we might look for to figure something out. This is a map of marten occupancy here in Vermont. So really a distribution, what we think marten distribution would look like across the Northeast. So in this particular case, what we really drew on was expert opinion. So we interviewed marten experts and then used that information to evaluate how likely the animal would be to use or occupy a given habitat type, like a given forest type. So even in cases where we don't have empirical data like hard locations and so forth, there are other ways to develop maps of where we think species should be. And in fact, in the case of marten here, the map that you see behind here, the red glowing areas represent higher areas of what we call occupancy, or the chance of occurring, relative to the cooler blue areas where we don't expect them to be. We found that expert opinion approach actually performed pretty well when compared to like real locations that we had of martens sprinkled across this region. So when you test that model, actually predicted with a decent amount of confidence where we expect them to be. So I think trying to figure out, like, what would the landscape in Vermont and more regionally look like? Where would we expect them to go? Is within the realm of reason from a scientific point of view, and I think that would provide a nice baseline. We have incidentally done this for multiple species, most of the smaller, medium, and large carnivores here in the state, with pretty good success, with exception to one species, the gray fox, which didn't model too well. So where would they live? I think another piece of this would be to identify, like, how many catamounts could live in this landscape. And that's a slightly harder question. Abundance is always tricky to estimate. How many could live in the landscape? There are some crude ways that could be done to get at that question. One approach that I mentioned here that was developed by colleague Terry Donovan, who's part of the Vermont Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, had a chance to join in on this project as well, ended up using a technique that's used by social media companies, something called maximum click analysis. It's a technique that's used to identify cliques of friends, like networks of friends. And so the way it was applied here for a study of bobcats, I think this is in the Champlain Valley, was asking that question, how many bobcats could fit in this landscape? What is the maximum carrying capacity in this particular landscape? And so what they did is they started out with a map to the left, which was a map of like distribution. And then the map in the middle is they said, for every single one of those little pixels in that map, is there enough suitable habitat around it to support a home range, like for an individual? And so the black dots that you see there represent all of those pixels that could support a home range. And then this click analysis then comes in and says, all right, if we put a home range, like a circle on top of every one of those black dots, they'd all overlap. But we know because they're territorial, they're generally existing in non-overlapping ranges. So the click technique says, all right, we're going to try millions of different combinations of circles that are non-overlapping to find an optimal solution. In other words, how many circles, home ranges, could you cram in this landscape given what we know about the underlying conditions? And you see a resulting map there on the right, which gives you an estimate then of how many you think could live in this landscape. So again, we don't have a lot of empirical data on cougars in this part of the world, but we do have some sophisticated techniques and experience here in Vermont that could deliver on a number like that.
So this analysis was done for cougars in Vermont.
No, sorry, this is done for bobcats.
Bobcat,
It's been done for a couple of other species too.
sorry.
Yeah, here in Vermont, it was with bobcats, but I think we could do it here.
Yeah. And what is the home range of a bobcat? Do you know? I feel like
I don't want to misquote myself. I'd have to look it up. Home range sizes vary quite a bit. Really depends on prey conditions. I want to say a radius of maybe 3 to 4 kilometers, if I remember correctly. So again, that's an important part of the puzzle, right? How many could we have in this landscape, given the conditions that are out there? On top of that, it might be helpful to know how we expect these animals to move across the landscape. So like, here's what the landscape looks like. Here's how many we think could be in here. Now, if we zoom into actual animal movements, what would that look like? So I would reference another set of techniques that would allow us to do that in really the absence of a lot of empirical data, fine scale movement data that you might get, say, from radio collars. So this particular technique that we've used in studies with VTrans and also Vermont Fish and Wildlife is something called circuit analysis. And the way that works, it's a technique that's borrowed from electrical engineering. And the basic idea is that it treats the movement of animals across a landscape like the movement of electricity through a circuit. Right. So if you can imagine in simple terms, if you have two, let's say, protected areas, right, and you want to know what movement might look like between those two areas, this technique can become handy. So in a computer environment, you're basically attaching electricity to one of these areas and a ground, like a positive terminal here and a ground over here. And electricity is being fired through this landscape that includes good and bad habitats, right? It includes some places that are good and some places that are bad. And so how that electricity flows through that matrix of good and bad habitats to reach the other side can give a depiction of how you might expect animals to move through that landscape. But again, it's sort of like, in the electrical engineering world, it's like you have a power and a ground and electricity moving through a circuit of different resistances. Same idea, you have electricity simulating animal flow that's moving through a landscape of different resistances. And again, validation studies have shown it's actually pretty good at reflecting where we expect animals to be moving. So what you see here is the results of a recent piece of work that we've been trying to finalize here, showing expected paths of movement from moose. And even though at a coarse scale of New England, it's a bit of a wash, when you zoom in, it gives you some real fine-grained measures of what that movement might look like. And there are ways then to categorize that current flow into areas that are far more conducive to flow and those that aren't. Those areas that show pinch points of movement and so forth can be helpful, again, for exploring how we expect animals to move across a landscape. So again, I think that's within the realm of possibility. And we've done that for a number of different species here in Vermont too, some of which you see here. And then there's the question of food. Is there enough food? Cougars have a very wide distribution, one of the widest ranging distributions, I would say, of the carnivores and among the mammals in terms of latitude. So they occur from southern South America all the way to northern North America through desert environments to tropical forests. They're very flexible in terms of habitats they can use, but also the things that they can eat. So they have pretty broad diets in some areas. But by and large, there's more of an emphasis on the bigger things. So deer would probably be the main source of food. The question is, do we have enough deer here? That might take some investigation from my reading. I saw one estimate that reckoned that or calculated that about 860 to 1,300 kilograms of food would be needed per adult cougar. So that would translate into about 14 to 20 deer per individual per year. There's a lot of wiggle room around those numbers, but I think trying to address, like, do we have that capacity? Do we have that prey base that could withstand a certain amount of predation would be important, right? So we may have enough deer, say now, but after several years of predation, how does that deer population affected directly from that predation? So I want to mention a couple other considerations here too. I do think the issue of regional support is really important. I don't know whether other states are interested in this issue too, New York, New Hampshire, Maine. But I feel like that regional support is important. Like, we are Vermont, we have a relatively small landscape. We're what, about 25,000 square kilometers. We may be able to support a small population, but it's likely that those animals will disperse out into different parts of the state. Different parts of the region, especially during reintroduction. So just getting back to, well, I'll hold that for a moment. So recognizing that support, I think, is actually important. I'd hate to see a circumstance where animals are reintroduced, they immediately start moving out, and then they're shot and killed. So in some ways, I think there's some ethical considerations too. And we've seen that in a lot of reintroductions and translocations where mortality rates can be really high. I know this sounds fundamental, but engaging with the public to me is really critical. And that's not just necessarily the strong voting blocs, but engaging with broader constituencies, rural Vermont, even indigenous communities. So sorry about that. And so forth, I think is really critical. And many reintroduction programs fail because of, I think, improper public engagement. Some examples that I guess come to mind immediately. I have a family member from Spain. Black brown bears were reintroduced, big brown bears into the Pyrenees. That was a decision made largely in Barcelona that wasn't given, that didn't provide much input from local communities. And it's become a real challenge. That bear population has expanded. They're eating a lot of livestock. There's a real tension now among communities in some of these Pyrenees areas. If you think about the case with wolves, in fact, in Colorado, there was a ballot measure that led to the reintroduction of wolves in central Colorado. It's created this kind of urban-rural divide where much of the decision was made by the voting public in the Front Range, and those animals were reintroduced into rural places with a lot of livestock. So some engagement with the public, I think, is really critical. I think a management program has to be well designed to address the reasons why these animals went extinct, locally extinct in the first place. and to ensure that there's some measure of adaptive management for those animals that are put in the landscape. Oftentimes, we fail to address those key concerns, and reintroduced animals are then often dead and can die. So I think ensuring that we're addressing those core fundamental reasons why the species was extirpated is important. And then recognizing that adequate funding is really key, not just short-term funding to make something happen, but longer-term funding that allows for adaptation over time. And again, most of these efforts provide short-term funding and then they walk away, and that's when the problems start. So I think recognizing that funding and ensuring there's adequate staff to manage the program is critical. I'm sure as the Environment Committee, you're aware that we do have a rich history of reintroductions here in the state. The birds tend to get a lot of the limelight. But I would say that we have reintroduced some mammal species here. See two examples, right? The first one is American marten, which largely went locally extinct here in Vermont due to overhunting and habitat loss in the late 1800s, early 1900s. In the 20th century had only about 4 records, confirmed records. And in the late 1980s and early 1990s, about 115 animals were reintroduced from animals in the Adirondacks and also from Maine. Right at that point of release in southern Vermont, in the years that followed, we had some animals that died, some animals that disappeared. We had one animal, I think, that went back to Maine, so took a trek for 245 kilometers. So they can move. An interesting and I think nice story here is that originally, I guess the effort kind of fizzled, and the thought was that this was really an unsuccessful attempt, and it was pioneering. I would say that this was at this time, this is a really pioneering effort. We followed up with genetic studies not too long ago of martens that have been recently discovered in southern Vermont. And as it turns out, the evidence seems to suggest genetically that the animals that we're seeing in southern Vermont actually are remnants of that original reintroduction. So we're seeing actually some longer term success that wasn't expected right at the beginning. The other example, of course, is Fisher. Fisher had a similar fate to marten in the late 1800s, early 1900s, overhunting, loss of habitat. That created large populations of porcupines, which can have effects on trees through their kind of bark eating and girdling effects. They can kill trees. There was a concern over timber in that case. And various state entities ended up in the 1950s and 60s reintroducing Fishers into about 37 towns here in Vermont. And now Fishers are really pretty widespread here across the state and have brought porcupine populations down. So we do have some relatively recent history with reintroductions of carnivores. Now, these are different carnivores. They're medium to smaller size. Larger carnivores bring on another set of problems. A few more points and then I'll wrap up. So thank you for your patience here. I would say that beyond Vermont, there is a lot of support out there for reintroductions and translocations globally. We've reintroduced about 1,500 species, apparently. And one group that I mentioned is the IUCN Species Survival Commission Conservation Translocation Specialist Group. So they used to be called the Reintroduction Specialist Group, changed their name, but they are like a particular themed specialist group under the umbrella of the IUCN. And they have a mountain of resources on and case studies on what works and doesn't work, what guidelines one should follow for reintroducing species. They do trainings as well. So we do have a lot of learned experience from reintroductions that really have taken off since the late 1980s. And I would say too, I guess, that any effort to reintroduce catamounts should just continue to remember that they are animals. They're not numbers. They're not units. They are living beings that are existing in these environments. And I think a lot of care needs to go into how reintroductions actually occur. I've seen in many cases where animals that have been reintroduced have really, most of them have died. And I think there's an ethical challenge that comes with that. We do have some recent examples of large similar cats that have been reintroduced. This is an example you may be aware of that got a lot of public attention. In 2022, there was a reintroduction of cheetahs in India. So cheetahs actually have a relatively close genetic relationship with mountain lions and cougars, mountain lion cougars, and another species called the jaguarundi, but there is some similarity there. This one got a lot of attention. It was driven by a head of state, Narendra Modi, who you can see in this image here, just above one of the first cheetah that were released. It involved our best science. It involved top experts at its inception. There were about 20 animals that were brought in from South Africa and Namibia for this effort. Huge fanfare, brought into a national park called Kuno National Park. But it hasn't gone so well. About 9 died of unusual things like heart failure and renal failure, infections even under these radio tracking collars that led to maggot infestations that killed a number of the cats, infighting and so forth. We've had poor health, malnutrition as ongoing issues. They're actually coming into villages seeking food. There are reports of some villagers actually feeding these cheetah. And most of the remaining cheetah have now moved back into enclosures. So what are the reasons for that? There's a whole number of reasons. The park is generally a bit too small. The prey base wasn't quite adequate enough. There are a lot of political complexities and some changes around expertise here that had some strong impacts. So again, I just offer this in some ways as a caution, right? Here's an example where we had a lot of political will to do this. We had a head of state, global head of state involved. We had some great expertise, and it hasn't gone so well. So I don't want to end on a sour note, but it is just a reminder of that ethical part and the fact that reintroductions can be complex. The final point that I'd like to make does relate to the state of mammals here in Vermont too. And I say this as chair, I guess, of the Mammal Scientific Advisory Group. We do have 61 native mammal species here in the state. But one thing I think is important to recognize is that at least in the last Wildlife Action Plan, which was 2015, we're in the process of redoing the next version, 34 of those species were listed as medium or high priority species of greatest conservation need. So that list did include mountain lion, cougars and wolves. So if you remove those because they're extirpated locally here, that ends up being about 52% of our mammal species fall into those categories, those 2 categories of species of greatest conservation need. So at one level, I think there's a lot of value in restoring ecosystems and bringing these species back, but I'd also like to make the point that a number of our existing mammal species also need some attention. So in terms of allocating resources, I'd advocate even for some of the smaller things that don't get attention the way catamounts do, including this one that some of you may not even know, which is the southern bog lemming. I believe it's possible we have the northern bog lemming here too, but only known from a few localities here. There may be other places that they occur, but hot button species. And then among carnivores, of course, I mentioned marten, but also long-tailed weasel too. So we do have some needs for the mammal community beyond those that are extirpated. All right, thank you very much. This is the closest I could get to a catamount photo. Yeah, but thank you for your attention, and I hope that it's somewhat valuable to you. So I appreciate all of your efforts on this.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'll kick it off with a question. Can you speak a little bit to the success of mountain lions out west? at all? Is that something you know about?
I'm not a mountain lion expert, but I think populations are generally pretty robust in western states. I mean, they're large enough that they are hunted as a game species in a number of like the western states, Montana, Wyoming, I think Colorado too. I'm not an expert on that, but populations seem to be relatively strong.
I just didn't know. It seems like it's sort of similar to bear here, where they've been going up over the last, I don't know, 30 years. I don't know if that's true.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, estimating abundance is a really tricky issue.
Thinking about that.
How many is such a fundamental question, but actually arriving at a number with some degree of confidence is statistically really difficult to do. A lot of our estimates are based on hunter data, which can have a number of biases in it. I mean, it's the best we can do in a lot of cases with limited resources. But sometimes those numbers aren't quite right. But I think indications are that populations are reasonably strong in some of those western states.
Have you ever been part of a feasibility study for reintroduction of an animal?
Not per se. I was involved in a study in Zambia that reintroduced lions into a park where they've been extirpated. They were actually down to a population size of one. It was one female. And it was tricky. There's so many issues surrounding that were challenging. I mean, for one, a number of places were actually unwilling to provide animals to reintroduce because lions drive, are an economic engine. Tourists go to see lions. And so the idea of saying, oh, we're going to take your lions, that landscape and move it somewhere else was a challenge. There were a number of animals that died during translocation, animals that moved out of the landscape. The long and short of it, after about 10, 12 years, as the population went from about 1 to probably 7 to 10 animals. So it's a slow process. I think in terms of feasibility, it may be worth exploring, some of the literature around decision-making science, right? So how you make decisions around what to introduce. We do have some expertise at that at UVM and wildlife decision-making. So using frameworks then that can help you identify like what the best strategy is to reintroduce, given the discrete objectives you have. And those objectives might be related to environment, ecology, they might relate it to economics and people and so forth. So the idea is to basically say, here's a whole different variety of different scenarios that could be deployed to restore these animals, right? And so you're basically trying to figure out what is the consequence of each one of those alternatives on each one of your objectives. Basically evaluate which one of those might be best. So we've seen that happen in some cases. So which would give you the most impact, or which decision would be best?
Representative Bartholomew.
Did I understand you correctly that martins and fishers were gone or mostly gone?
I think that was gone, mostly gone.
And where
Yeah.
were they trapped, hunted? Where did they go?
Yeah, mostly over trapping. And in the late 1800s, we didn't have the forest today. So forest loss, habitat loss, and over hunting, unregulated hunting, trapping. Yeah. Were they completely gone? A little hard to say, but very few. Yeah.
Representative Austin.
I have two questions. One is, why did the catamounts go extinct? And the second is about reproduction, breeding. Do you have to reintroduce like two different species so you don't get like one group just, inbreeding? Do you have to reintroduce another one, let's say in Canada and New York?
Right. Okay. Yeah. So first question, I think, was for similar reasons. I think they were considered like a pest species, right? Disrupting livestock, killing livestock. perceived to be a threat. And so there was, really a culture around eliminating large carnivores from ecosystems. So overhunting, just hunting and active efforts to extirpate them. I think the last cougar was killed in 1881, I want to say. It's at the Historical Museum with the gun that shot it, I think. But was I think the largest cat on record recorded here at 180 pounds. It's a big animal. Normally, males would probably come in at, say, around 140 pounds. So it was quite a big animal. Yeah, so I think so the next question was about what animals would you select really to reintroduce, and how would you manage that over time? So a real challenge is when you put animals together, if they start mating, you have a called founder effect. So all of a sudden you have this really small, limited gene pool. And if they start breeding together, inherently you get inbreeding. That can lead to all sorts of problems. You may have discussed the issue with Florida panthers, which are a subspecies of cougar that have had a whole host of inbreeding problems that required a rescue from a genetic rescue. So cats from Texas that were brought in to basically infuse more genetic diversity in the population. So genetics certainly has to be a consideration, and we know in the case of cougars that did play out in Florida. So in some ways that ties in with decision making and adaptive management and the value of a management program. If you put these animals in, there has to be some thought around like ensuring that those animals have adequate genetic diversity. So they're not like, say, a brother and a sister that you put there, but they might come from different regions. A geneticist could speak more to how that would be done. But then also thinking about how you might supplement that population over time with additional animals. Yeah, it can be a real concern. I mean, you're talking about a very small number of individuals at first.
Representative Pritchard.
Thanks. This was good. The wolf thing in Denver or in Colorado, there's a perfect example. I worry about that happening here. I think a lot of our folks here, it's a warm and fuzzy thing, but I don't think they understand the reality of doing something like this. And I think the first and foremost should be what's in the best interest of the cougar. So I guess taking into account the multiple roadways that we have and the other issues that you talked about, ethics and some of those other things. Is this really the right thing to do for the cougar?
You're asking a highly
I'm asking your
question.
opinion.
Well, I mean, part of me says, all right, we have eliminated larger carnivores from the Northeast, wolves and cougars. We know that they exist well in Western landscapes, but they're functionally gone from this landscape. So the part of me says, all right, well, we're in a position where we could restore these ecosystems by bringing these animals in. And I think there is value to that argument. At the same time, though, I do recognize that there are some hard realities to that. Ensuring that we have enough space and resources for those animals to live and to thrive. That's partly why I mentioned the regional support. These are animals that do spread out over large areas. I'd hate to see a circumstance where something like this happened, and it turns out that we end up with a situation like the cheetah, and we end up with a lot of split public opinion and division. They can cause conflict, and I think that would need to be managed very carefully. as a species, it's doing okay, right? But it is locally gone from this area.
But as far as the geography,
Mhm.
we're comparing apples to oranges.
So,
Montana is not Vermont.
That's very true. Yeah.
Utah is not Vermont.
so we're not like, okay, that was a great question and it's a great time to wrap up. Thank you for your presentation and seems like a great chance to talk about, like, that's why we're doing a feasibility study, because we don't have an answer to the question.
Yeah. I wish I could give you a hard answer on that, but it's a little challenging for me to do that. Yeah.
One more.
I'm not seeing this on my computer. Is it?
We're working on it.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
We're aware. Thank you. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
sharing your
Thank you
expertise.
very
Thanks for your time. Yeah.